Welcome, everyone, to Alaska Quarterly Review's Reading and Conversation series. This event is being recorded and will be aired on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgements. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land. Land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement towards decolonization and equity. And now to begin, I'm so excited that today's event features three wonderful writers: Jamaica Baldwin, Jamella Hagen, and Farah Peterson. And we're going to begin with Jamaica, and I'm going to do her introduction now. Jamaica Baldwin is a poet and educator. Her first book, Bone Language, was published by YesYes Books in June 2023. Her work has appeared in Guernica, World Literature Today, Ploughshares, Prairie Schooner, Poetry Northwest, and the Missouri Review, as well as AQR. She is the recipient of a 2023 Pushcart Prize, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, a RHINO Poetry Editor's Prize, the Glenna Luschei Prairie Schooner Award, as well as the San Miguel de Allende Writers Conference Contest Poetry Award. Jamaica has also served as a community-based teaching artist and writer in the schools, presenter in Seattle, Louder Than a Bomb, Great Plains, an affiliate of the Nebraska Writers Collective, and taught a generative writing workshop for the women in Guatemala. Her writing has been supported by Aspen Words, Storyknife, Hedgebrook, Furious Flower, and the Jack Straw Writers Program. Jamaica has a PhD from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, with a focus on poetry and women and gender studies. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Writing at Ithaca College in New York. Of her work, Kwame Dawes has said, Baldwin's recent debut collection contains a lament for the inadequacy of dreams in our world. Yet hope is found in her beautiful writing and deeply sophisticated thinking. Her language is spare, and her many voices communicate with an arresting strangeness that is at once elegant and disquieting. She is a fully formed and extremely important poet. Let's welcome Jamaica Baldwin.
Thank you so much, Ron. Thank you for organizing this event and bringing us all together. Thank you to the Anchorage Museum for hosting us. It is a real pleasure to share space with Farah and Jamella, and I really look forward to hearing them read. I also want to thank Danny, who is our tech wizard today. So I will be reading a handful of poems from my debut book, Bone Language, which was published last June. And then I will also read a couple poems that are not in there, including the one that I had the fortune of having published with AQR. So the first poem I'm going to share with you is titled The Mess a Body Makes, and it is actually the first poem in the book. My mother offered me her history, licking the fat off each gristled story. her fingers shiny with the destruction of her youth. I followed carefully behind, consuming the world with unwritten poems sewed into the hem of my dress, a dull razor tucked beneath my tongue. At the clearing in the woods, I built a church out of the tender violence of words. I wallow at the altar and worship the mess a body makes, barricaded inside its own hailstorm of hunger. I never learned how to pray, but perhaps the animal body is all I need in the end. Perhaps when my words inevitably fail, I will open my mouth wide, only to close it again, to bite down hard one last time, to gnaw the bone, to lick the red language from my fingers, glistening. This next poem I'm going to read was written sort of in conversation with or as a response to the book Playing in the Dark by Toni Morrison. When I was 12, I learned Morse code, spent a weekend at Pigeon Point Lighthouse with a ham radio, tapping greetings to kids in Russia, then waiting for their response in return. Now, when I think of lighthouses, I think of us eager to reach across borders, or that Sinead O'Connor song about the woman forever waiting for her man to return from sea. And sometimes I'm the woman alone in a lighthouse with underwater memories, always waiting. Some nights I search my body with a flashlight for signs of a future. Light, we've been taught, is how we find each other in the dark. The omnidirectional lens guiding boats away from dangerous edges, the North Star, the moonlight, a point of reference to cling to in the dark emptiness of night. Dark, empty. The language they ascribe to our bodies is made of the same shadow and warning. It's no wonder they fear us. No wonder my father at 63 was a miracle. No wonder night, like his body, has been riddled with the language of dread. But light isn't the surest way home. We've grown accustomed to the ease of it, as if ease was the point of living. Grown idle in our new skins, forgetting our nocturnal ways. Every now and then I remember what it felt like to see in the dark, beyond what the light reveals, to see how perfect we all are in the absence of its confident gaze. I've never seen a night unpolluted by light, never loved a body that wasn't held up to light scrutiny, but I'm learning. Last night I ate in the dark, closed the blackout curtains and touched my body in new ways. I remembered to be grateful. I remembered what Toni Morrison said about impenetrable whiteness, that such illusions are sinister and lazy. I remember that shadow is only ominous because language made it so. I swear to you, listening to Nina Simone in the assiduous dark will shatter you on a cellular level. This is the ocean of what we've lost, inscribed in night's unfolding. Not an eek, but a bellow, a darkness so rapturous it blinds. I realized that I didn't state the title of that poem, which I've never done before. That poem was called Seeing in the Dark. And the next poem I'm going to read is called Father Weaver. I don't remember where my pages are. There we go. If he wasn't janitor, he'd be gravel artist. He'd be glitter farmer. He'd groove skate down Beach Hill to Isley Brothers. If he wasn't janitor, he'd be tennis racketeer, ocean tamer, cicada sequencer. He'd turn his knit cap upside down to catch fireflies, load them into pitching machine, point upwards and shoot stars into sky. If he hadn't been liquor undertaker, booze regulator, drunk gambling wish denier, he might have been daughter wrangler, fear whisperer, sweet lullaby impersonator. His underwater voice might have sung me to float and swell. If he hadn't been vodka foreman, he might have used strands of daughter hair to draw maps of blackness onto his back. I might have watched them stretch and curve and maze him into father quest, into secret daughter mission. I'd pack a flashlight and meals for the trip. I'd stretch and nimble get. I'd compass take, whistle, and song I path follow and lost get, and around turn, till I center reach and undead him. And this next poem is called The End of Sorrow is Not Happiness. I've gained many things since cancer, poetry, extra weight, a distrust of happiness. The way this country names it a pursuit, a destination most are never meant to reach. No matter how many shovels we break digging, there is always more earth, more history, more heft required to fail. Even if I could make my way through their labyrinth of promises without coming undone, I'm not sure I'd want to give up my sorrows. All my reckless patience, wandering through untamed hallways. I've grown accustomed to their defiance, to the melancholy of women unbolting private alienations. I prefer this fracture of a home we built together, without borders, without hustle. And the birds pay us no mind here, nor the trees, nor moss. So much endless, brilliant moss. Thank you all again for inviting me and having me here and listening to these poems. I'm going to end with a poem that was published in AQR, and it's titled, After So Much Destruction, I Give Up. After so much destruction, I give up motherhood for this sorrow of poems. Speaking of destruction, too much is made of a girl's innocence, her body, a howl of hornets, her rage, a mouthful of cornfields. First, the bees disappear from her hair, then the fire spreads from the soles of her feet. Beneath an old church, a graveyard of children. The air around the church is filled with the aftermath of egg, a dream of sulfur. Behind an altar of teeth, a bird mouth opens. I have nothing to feed it. The small child holds out her hands. I have nothing to fill them. In this decade of my life, bones and tissue have been replaced with silicone and metal, and this feels somehow right. A body conforming to its habitat. But darkness is more than unrequited sadness. See, my unbeloved, how not belonging to ourselves we've become. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce our second presenter, poet Jamella Hagen. Jamella is a Canadian poet and educator. Her first collection of poetry, Kerosene, was published by Nightwood Editions. In addition to publishing poems in Alaska Quarterly Review, her poems appeared in journals across Canada, including ARC, Event, and the Malahat Review, as well as in the anthologies Unfurled, Collected Poetry from Northern BC Women, New and Selected Poems, and Best Canadian Poetry in English. It's also published in Canadian Literature, the Globe and Mail, and Ploughshares. Jamella teaches English and creative writing at Yukon University in Whitehorse, Yukon. Of her poetry, Harbor Publishing has observed, Hagen has mastered the trick of animating fleeting moments with an elegant touch that evokes both familiarity and wonder. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Jamella Hagen.
Hello, thank you very much, Ron, for that introduction. I'm going to start with a thank you. I am joining you today, as Ron said, in Whitehorse, Yukon, and want to acknowledge that I'm here on the traditional territories of the Kwanlin First Nation and the Ta'an Council, and that I am deeply grateful to be here. I also want to thank the other readers here. It's lovely to be reading with you in community, and Alaska Quarterly Review, Ron Spatz as well, for all the work that you do, and really literary journals generally for the important work that I feel literary journals do in the world of literary publishing. I'm going to read for you today a poem from my book, Kerosene, and some poems that have been published more recently in journals from my new manuscript. I'm going to start with a poem that came out in Alaska Quarterly Review. It's a poem that is partly about the first time I came north as an adult, a number of years ago. I've lived in Whitehorse since 2009, but this is from well before that time. Shout out to my friend Joyce Law, who made the trip with me, who was from Toronto at the time. This poem is also partly about light and darkness. And I feel that probably most of you know that in the far north, in the winter, it's very, very dark. And in the summer, there is so much light that light becomes essentially a character in your life. So this poem is called Yukon Insomnia File. Even with curtains pulled all the way to desperate edges of the windows, even with the old green sheet hung behind them, the light gets in. I check the clock, and later the official time of sunrise, 3:29 a.m. The exact minute I turned my head to the faint digital glow. Did a bird chirp, a squirrel backlip off the fence to signal sunup, or does our body just know? When we look at the bright sky and don't see a faint trace of aurora, stars, memories we stuffed in winter's purse and forgot about, do they still register in some sense, like figures in overexposed photographs? Light obscures as much as darkness. Some creatures wait for one, others the reverse. I still remember my slam dunk heart on the highway when I learned moose emerge at dusk. Joyce hunting under her seat for a camera as the cow blinked great lashes toward the windshield. The two of us, 22, high on our ability to drive a stick shift pickup as far as the road would take us. This next poem also appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review. It's from a series of poems that I wrote about northern jobs. The characters in these poems are fictional. This poem's called The Astronomer. He lifts a glass, brandy dark as cheap shelving from 1975. He was drunk then, too, and made mistakes his grown children don't remember. They were that bad. Frankly, the boys don't remember years at a time. There are gaps in their collective recollections they know may shed light on their own misplaced comments and fractured Corningware. But who wants to drag those moments out like chewed furs from under the bed, lousy with mothballs and mold? Much better to turn, take a mouthful of barbecued chicken, listen to the wind brush across the bough of a cedar like a parent's hand across a toddler's brow. Through the closed living room window, a meteor, or maybe a slip of the mind. Next, I'm going to read a poem from my book, Kerosene. And this poem also appeared in an earlier version in another Alaska publication, an anthology called Ice Flow. It's about a glacier, not too surprising, but actually the glacier that it's about, the Perito Moreno Glacier, is found in Argentina, closer to the Antarctic. And I'll also just say that this poem was written at an earlier stage of the conversation around climate change, but I do feel that it still holds. Perito Moreno, ice, the long white tongue of it. All day this glacier breaks and falls thundering, piece by piece, into the blue. Icebergs bob in the swells, one turns over, slow tilt, then a quick slip and burst of submerged ice. Naked, wet blue, it drifts loose of this 60-meter wall of evidence. Things are slipping away. Each time a piece calves off, the lake rises to receive it. A wave ripples out and sweeps the shore, collecting what it can. Travelers have disappeared this way, washed under in their quest to get close, to get closer. This next poem that I'm going to read is called Perfect Weather. It is one of the hardest poems, was one of the hardest poems for me to write, and it's also one of the hardest to share. But I've decided to share it with you today, and I would like to thank the Malahat Review, a great Canadian literary journal out of University of Victoria, for publishing this poem. This is Perfect Weather. That day in Naramata, we watched the fires start. The house so fancy, I kept tripping over footstools. As usual, he refused alcohol and all manner of luxuries, while I grew tipsy on wine coaxed from grapes grown right outside on gently terraced vineyards sloping to the lake. There was no real sign yet of trouble. An overripe cherry hit the window like a starling. Summer air settled over us like an electric blanket on high. Sweat sprung in agile little bubbles from our skin. "This wine is corked," shouted the hostess. I flinched, tried to hide my discomfort in the forking of barbecued potatoes. When I looked up, storm clouds were cresting the parched hills above the Coquihalla. We saw the first plume go up, and soon water bombers were swarming the lake like horseflies. Did we hear thunder? I don't recall witnessing a single strike, but dark funnels of smoke began to multiply. We fell asleep to a red glow that singed our dreams, and by morning, there was only one road out of there still open. As we crawled past candled trees under police escort, I covered my mouth and my child's with a t-shirt, but it still burned to breathe. A year later, when I left my partner, I turned the word escalation over and over in my mind. It sparked electric, It smelled of shame and spoiled cherries, but I held it to my breast like a child, covered our mouths with a t-shirt, and took a chance on what appeared to be the last road out. Okay, from there, I'm going to lighten things up a little bit. I'm going to read a poem that appeared in Ploughshares magazine, which was really a dream for me to have a poem in that publication, especially as a Canadian writer and especially as a Northern Canadian writer from a small town. And this poem is about, it's about education, it's about math, it's about growing up in a small town where educational opportunities are very different from what they are in some other places. This poem is called Dear Substitute Math Teacher. I will always remember Pythagoras because of you. An artist, not a scholar, carpenter, or for that matter, a teacher at all. Even in grade 8, we understood you taught a squared plus b squared equals c squared for 3 straight months because it was the only math you knew, and our regular teacher with his reheated coffees and summer turtlenecks refused to return from stress leave. At the second worst school in BC, no one worried about lapses in curriculum. We turned up our noses at your lack of deodorant, but one girl had glimpsed a painting in a local gallery, nudes around a table eating apricots. Each time a student jumped out the frosted window while your back was turned, did you think of a fresh tube of burnt sienna? We were the children of hunters, loggers, runaway hippies, and by then even we knew there wasn't a right-angled triangle in the world we couldn't solve now. Like the chemistry teacher who failed chemistry and the French teacher who had never been to France, you eventually returned to the urban pastures from whence you came. When you sit painting now in your East End apartment, do you think of us? Poor kids wearing too much denim, playing on trash heaps of trauma, solving and solving and solving for A. Okay, I'm going to read one more poem for you. This poem is a short poem. It's about the boreal forest. And I feel like a lot of people know that the Amazon rainforest is very important to the world ecosystem. And I think it is becoming more and more recognized that the northern circumpolar boreal forest is also incredibly important to the atmosphere and ecosystem of the world. And the boreal forest is often referred to these days as the lung of the world. So that is the title of this poem. It's a bit whimsical. It's very loosely a sonnet, and I will read it for you now. The lung of the world. In a stand of short spruce, you wouldn't guess each needle breathes its own mantra twice a week, works out at the discount gym downtown, or runs the Blackstreet stairs to take the edge off November. Though just now, as the blush of afternoon sunset begins, the boreal forest forgets all that. The needles tinge pink, belly laugh at one another's new jokes, blow oxygen smoke rings toward the late show, exploding over the horizon. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful, Jamella. Thank you so much. Our last reader is Farah Peterson. Farah is an essayist and poet. Her nonfiction, including personal essays, art criticism, and social commentary, has appeared in Ploughshares, The American Scholar, The Best American, Magazine Writing, Threepenny Review, and The Atlantic. Her works were selected as notable essays in the Best American Essays in 2018 and 2022. She was a finalist for the National Magazine Award in 2021. Her scholarship on statutory interpretation of constitutional law has appeared in the Yale Law Review, Columbia Law Review, and the Virginia Law Review. Farah Peterson is also a professor of law at the University of Chicago School of Law. She holds a PhD in American history from Princeton University. She earned her JD degree from Yale and received her bachelor's in history from Yale as well. After law school, Farah clerked for Associate Justice Stephen Breyer on the U.S. Supreme Court and Judge Guido Calabrese on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. It's my pleasure to introduce Farah.
Thank you very much for having me. It's such a pleasure to read in such distinguished company. The first poem I want to read today is the first that I published with Alaska Quarterly Review. It came out in this last fall issue, in the fall-winter issue of this previous year. This is called Pretenses. With biscuits from the Plantation House Hotel, wrapped in a hasty napkin, we went early, out where morning fired frost-tipped stands of grass. Our shotguns cold and heavy in our hands. My dad had his cracked resting on one shoulder and laughed over the other shoulder with our guide. The borrowed dogs, spilling from the flatbed, dispersed like fish released into still water until, triumph of domestication, the stock-still point, a mobile nose, a spray of urine, otherwise fixed. What were we doing there, two northern blacks, in a field once farmed by slaves? Harrying quail released the night before to hurry in meandering lines from their safe cages? Was it only to pretend that meat well laced with buckshot is as good as meat without? We beat together through the grass, advancing to where the dog still pointed out our quarry, his stance unchanging as we neared the hidden covey, but somehow starting to convey hysteria. And then a sudden bursting at our feet, ululating volley of veering wings. Unused to this, we stood briefly amazed, aiming late and almost into the sun. Some of this was real enough. One of the birds I shot was not quite dead when the dog placed its tender body in my hand. Arrested by a sensation like a finger, tapping swift insistence on my palm, I felt the bird's heart still. I met a black caviar eye as it filmed over blue. At times I found I had to shield my face against undulating switchbacks of the smoke, acrid incense from a deadly censer. But it was not a day to speak of things like that. Nor did we ever mention the missing son, for whom I made an adequate understudy. This poem is out in the current issue of Salamander. It's called Marigolds. October garden, mostly dead. Time sprawling incense underfoot, and of course the marigolds. Crazed stems, jungle cluster, bright torches glowing as from the well of a spiral stair. These I follow circling down, and bumblebees come, honeybees come, little pin of a bee I cannot name, and comes the carrion eater, the quilted monarch settling to velvet-gloved applause. In his train comes too a familiar, a stout brown, four-winged butterfly, come to impel me back in time and force memory to surprised utterance. We used to catch this kind, Carrie and I, a kid who was violent and whom no one else liked. There were marigolds there too, along the side of our playground. And these fat moths were easy to catch, either in cupped hands or by pinching the wings between fingers. So many wings stripped to translucency, the powder from those wings covering our palms, our game until my family moved away, leaving him and his violence and his reasons for it behind. Will this be the afterlife then? Inscrutable monarch, votary guide, the shades of those I've hurt or left or uncocooning, pushed aside. Will I remember then, as I do now, indulgently, no more than the pain I caused, with hands too childish to retain the stain? Or will there be shame? This poem is in the current issue of the Florida Review. It's called Chop Chop. When my son had his field trip to the conservatory, he wanted to tell me all about the plant that recoils when struck. I had to admit I'd seen that one before. He was so excited, but of course, there's nothing odd about the behavior in a person when you think about it. My little sensitive kid who scolds my husband for not shaving close enough, who responds to the hail of paternal kisses with a half-delighted, "Don't you know I'm delicate?" I think I was pregnant the night we heard a man trying to break in. My husband got the shotgun and I said, "Let me." Not because I thought I was more likely to hit the guy. Anyone can hurt someone with a shotgun. But because I was sure I could make no difference to me. When I told my dad, it was with a little shitty smile that he asked, who was going to take the shot? As it happens, my dad and I both have this genetic flaw about anesthesia. We metabolize it too quickly. Because I'm Black, I guess, my OB didn't believe me, but I didn't want my baby to start life to the sound of my distress. So I let baby do the screaming, met him with a smile. There are other ways to deal with the problem of pain. In my marriage, I've generally been the one to do these things. When we needed to give up the pet we cosseted, I took it to the shelter. When we found those snakes in the house, I got the shovel, I cut off their heads. Swift, sure strike of the wedge, no problem. But lately, I've been thinking about this question. How much cruelty does it take to raise a child? When my son was 2, my dad noticed that he gets angry too quickly, and he advised me that I would have to start hitting him. And all I could think about was the belt of my childhood, and far behind that, the lash, and my dad's hand in friendship afterward. Sometimes I look at my children and wonder while they're carrying on the way that they do. I listen to how easily they put a name to how they feel and how they can just say it and say it. And although I've made my choice, God forgive me, I wonder if that will ever hurt them. Dad told me long ago never to give a friend a knife because it would sever the friendship, but one Christmas he gave me some knives. And although we don't talk anymore, and I got rid of every other thing of his, I use those knives every day. But it's not because I didn't love him, only that I've come to love my sons more. And after all, Love is not a feeling, as Wittgenstein said. It's just that, unlike pain, love is put to the test. One does not say, that was not a real pain, just because it passed. This final poem I'm going to read is forthcoming in the Alaska Quarterly Review. It's a shorter one, and I'm very grateful to Ron for accepting it. This is called Cards. It's all I can do to keep my peace when my son announces he has a good hand. I wince when he lets cards tip as well as carelessly as a child unschooled. Of course I look, I can't help that. I'm just passing an evening the way he asked, and don't I win meekly, with none of that slapping down hilarity, or even the quiet, cruel collection with one knuckle snap and half smile. None of the good old fun that went with my learning to keep cards close and expect dissembling. But the result is, all I have for him is a muzzled company, and all of the ghosts, they crowd me and crowd me. Thanks so much, Ron. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Farah. What a wonderful reading. And thank you, all of you, Jamaica and Jamella. What an exciting time to hear your work and to meet at least two of you for the very first time. And I'm just very excited what your view is about the state of the world and how poetry fits in it for you. There's a lot of pressure these days to say that the arts don't matter, that they're frivolous. All kinds of pressure to let the market dictate what gets published. Lots of polarization attached to just about everything these days. So here's a question that I wonder if you would engage in, and just turn it over to you, and then it'll come back to me when you're done with it. But it's not an exaggeration to say that the world is imploding pretty much on every level that you look, whether it's climate change, whether it's human rights, whether it's politics. It's just hard to get beyond all of that. So, with the world imploding, how does poetry stitch things together for you? So I just turn it over to you, and then when you're done talking about it, we'll stop and I'll make a final remark. Well, one of you need to start.
Do you want me to jump in? I can say a couple of things. I think, first of all, I'm just blown away by both of your readings. So thank you so much for that. It was wonderful to hear your work and to be in this space of poetry today. I think for me, Ron, it's definitely easier to answer that question on a more personal level. How does poetry stitch things back together? I don't know that I can speak for anything outside of that, but I do think that personally wrestling with philosophical questions of living is something that I do in poetry, but I also find for myself as a poet, and I don't think this is the same for all writers, that I often don't start with a particular intention or direction. I usually start from an image and find it connecting to other images and see where that goes. So in a sense, I don't feel like I I don't want to say that there's no intentionality behind the work, or that the work writes itself, or anything like that, that doesn't take responsibility, but that I think sometimes it's so hard to engage with the hardest problems of living, that coming at it from one brief moment can be easier than trying to take on something bigger. And recently I was speaking with Canadian poet Karen Soley, who was saying that she feels, when you think about abstractions in poetry, that the abstract needs to arise out of the particulars. And I think that for a lot of us, we may start with one thing, and it spools out into something else. And certainly that we're all thinking about how to cope with our lives, and how to make the world a better place. And the last thing that I'll say is just that I've been thinking a lot about writing community lately. Have been organizing some readings, and seeing how in my small town, working together with our other artists and in collaboration, can create a space and a synergy where more stories arise, and more new stories maybe about how the world can come out of that. And I recently helped organize an event where someone afterward said to me, I think everyone in that room had a story to share. And I think, that's something a lot of people have said, but it has stayed with me. I'll stop there.
I can add something. Thank you for that, Jamella. I think for me, so much of how I've been engaging with this moment, and the role of art in this moment, has been through my role as a teacher. I'm typically a poet of reflection. That is, that I appreciate the distance that time affords. I don't usually write poems about my immediate experience, not as a rule, that's just been my natural inclination. However, through journaling, I've been working out my relationship to poetry making in this moment. But what has been a huge solace for me is my students. I see them wrestling with their feelings about all the many violences of this world. I see them wrestling with their privilege, with place and belonging, with ideas of justice. And I think in many ways, seeing them do that work and is kind of helping me find my way to the present. So teaching has been a real light in my life recently. The idea that I get to share poems with these young folks, when I see that sort of relaxation in their shoulders, when they connect with a new poet in a deep way, who's reflecting the urgency that they see around them, is just really exciting. So yes, art matters, poetry matters more than ever, I think.
In my job as a law professor, I teach people how to operate the levers of power. How to make government work, what to do when they're in positions of authority, how to make arguments to power that can move policy. And there is a distinction, I guess, one way of dividing the world between those who believe that we are a people, we in the United States, made up of fractious groups of disparate peoples, and should these groups be accommodated? And is that what the purpose of government is, to accommodate the differences? Or is the difference the problem? And the purpose of power is to consolidate one group over the others. And I think, there's no one thing that art is or does. But one of the cool things about poetry is one thing it can do is simply provide a means to display difference. And as an admirer of others' poetry, I can stand before the abyss of someone else's difference and just feel the breath coming out of the abyss. And it mitigates the discomfort one feels at noticing difference to stand in front of art. And especially as a member of a society with so many peoples of differing beliefs and personalities, you know, art provides a means of encountering it over and over again. And, you know, so here I am teaching people how to do government, use government, speak to government. But what is government for? It's, you know, a means to ensure human flourishing, right? And that's what art is. You know, many different instantiations of people just being themselves. Now, of course, that's just one thing. In Jamaica's poems, we also see another thing art does, which is show that tyranny does not just happen in big ways. Tyranny happens at the scale of the family. It happens in historical scale. You know, it happens in ways that are insidious and that root themselves in childhood. And so one thing that art does also is display the effects of the choice of different government choices that we make over time. So it can also be a record that tells us, well, what did those choices mean on a human scale? And that's also why art is dangerous and why again and again tyrants execute artists and artists go into exile.
Yeah, I think what you all said is really important, and starting with what Farah just said, we have a situation where there are a lot of things happening now. We're entering what may be a post-truth kind of world with lots of confusion on all kinds of levels. Art is essential in so many ways, and that which motivates people like me with Alaska Quarterly. That's been doing its thing now for 44 years, since the time that we founded it. Why? Because it's a search for truth. Art is a search for truth, and you could look at that on all kinds of different levels. Personal truth, right? What you think, what you feel. It can be about identity. It can be about understanding people around you through empathy, by making the world larger so you can inhabit other people's reality. It's incredibly important. Artists are sometimes the first people executed in any kind of a fascist or whatever takeover through history, authoritarian takeover. And so literary magazines that all three of you support are sort of the scaffolding of that voice, that collective voice and that single voice. So it's essential for identity, individual identity, collective identity, community identity, values. Without it, in a lot of ways, people are adrift, particularly as it's being delegitimized as having any purpose at all, which is quite ironic, since the things that have lasted through thousands of years is the arts, right? If you trace it back, what are people looking at for the history of humankind, right? They're looking at the arts as a reflection of who we are, even as human beings. So this has been so exciting this evening to have the three of you, three young poets and writers who are making a difference, who are confronting reality through your truth with honesty and integrity. And that's something that is important to the fabric of the literary arts. Since we have a Canadian with us, we won't say in America, we will say in North America. And it can't be more important than that. And as a final comment to add, I think it's really important for us to think about supporting literary magazines, as you have, and I'll just make the pitch for that. Of course, people should buy your books when they're out. So I'll make a pitch for that even first, because the market doesn't always work that way, does it? Things that are harder, maybe more difficult, you know, they don't get the same kind of play. But nonetheless, as Grace Paley said to me once, if we don't support the work of the artists and poets, who will? So I'm going to put that out there. And folks should subscribe to literary magazines like Alaska Quarterly, not only because we're small and absolutely need that support, but we are, again, the scaffolding. Work from Alaska Quarterly routinely appears in the best American anthologies in various ways. You'll find work in the upcoming Best American Poetry, for example, that'll be out in September. Where does it come from? Who gets the boost? There are no ticker tape parades down Fifth Avenue or whatever, you know, street you think it should happen for the literary magazine and their editors. But the fabric of the arts are the things that ultimately last, and also empowering writers with non-commercial work, which is our work as literary magazine editors, is where the difference makes. Throughout history, when you get the historical record, they're digging stuff up when they find the scrolls and other things. They're not finding necessarily the thing that was the commercial success. They're finding the art that lasts, as we always look for truth. So with that in mind, I want to thank Farah, Jamaica, and Jamella for participating tonight. We hope to see the rest of you back in our next event in our series. Thank you so much, and we'll see you the next time.